This is Lecture 57C, Part 1, in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018 series, Origins of the Indochinese Capitalist Stage. I'm going to just show you a book here real quickly called The Development of Capitalism in Colonial Indochina, 1870 to 1940, by Professor Martin J. Murray. This is a nearly 700-page book by a Marxist professor who has joined the growing pantheon of the ranks of Marxist professors in the English-speaking world. And he is, in my opinion, the best of these Marxist professors since the days of Philip Foner. And this book would be extremely helpful to any of you that have an interest in this particular subject. As I say, it's 700 pages long, but he manages to organize his data in such a way that you can, his good index, you can find pretty much what you need on any particular subject, and it was certainly helpful to me in getting this particular set of lectures together. In Volume 1 of this series, I explained that within the servitude epoch, feudalism is the intermediary stage between chattel slavery and wage slavery. As such, its own general crisis can be expressed in the forms of a quadratic equation, where the general crisis of slavery is descending in value, while the general crisis of capitalism is ascending. I'm not going to redefine to the terms general contradiction, general crisis at this time, but if you need to, you can go back and read that part of your book, and it's all in the initial glossary, as well as throughout the presentation. The slave stage itself features remnant icons, at least of the transitional stage that preceded it, which must always be the case, and it must also feature the seeds of its own successor stage. As we've seen, the slave stage in Indochina was always and early pregnant with the engine general crisis of the feudal stage. Why was that? Because, first of all, the position of the Indochinese peninsula in the Old World made it the necessary physical nexus between India and China. And secondly, as Japan and Korea developed their own slave and then feudal stages, the Indian trade with China became Indian trade with the Far East. So again, Indochina was always in the middle. And thirdly, eventually commerce between the Far East and Europe had to traverse the Malacca Straits and the great port cities of Indochina. Thus, Indochina was critical in the maritime trading belt of the Asian and African nations. Along the way, it was inevitable that a mercantile capitalist class would emerge in Indochina. It had to emerge within the context of the Indochinese agricultural slave stage, because that is what existed in Indochina. With regard to the feudal sprouts of capitalism, in AD 1000, Indochina entered that period of class compromise with farming people that guaranteed farmers certain rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we call feudalism. Feudalist kings ruled over the next 8 centuries. Most of this time, Indochinese feudalists were under Chinese suzerainty. In AD 900, the Indonesian capital was in northern Vietnam at Da La. It was a heavily populated city. Merchants in silk, ivory, gold, silver, paddy, rice, and other farm products ruled its residents. They employed a proto-proletarian class of free people. These merchants paid tribute to the landed nobility that ruled the agricultural economy that had been slave-based in terms of what constituted the cost of labor. By this time, Indochina was becoming feudal, and the cost of labor was negotiable. It was paid at a sharecrop price, or less often in cash. Either way, the landlords got labor peace, more or less. Now, the artisans of Da La were not only proto-proletarians, some were true petty bourgeois craftsmen. These people were masters of important skills in goldsmithing, copper and bronze casting, molding, and iron casting. The mercantile bourgeoisie of Hanoi used Chinese characters in their writing that enabled regulated commerce and credit. Now, with regard to the political regimes, Lê Huan, AD 941 to 1005, was the founding king of the first Lê dynasty when the threat of invasion by the Chinese Song dynasty in AD 982 was on the horizon. Lei Huan was the candidate of the bourgeoisie who had a primary interest in developing commerce, only part of which had to do with war contracting. Now, he opted for peace with China by stepping up regular large payments of cash and commodities. In other words, he bought peace by paying them more money. He championed the agricultural classes by participating in the post-Tet spring rice fertility festivals, as did later Indochinese kings, to show their allegiance to the nobility based on the feudal agricultural economy. His support also came from the merchant classes that sponsored his commerce and credit trade laws. And of course the burghers profited when he ordered the construction of canals, including the Ba Hoa Canal to Tan Hoa and the Da Ke Canal to Anggean. In fact, everyone was happy because the canal construction not only benefited the building capitalists, but the farmers who had a better irrigation system, and the merchants could expand and improve their transport routes. So under the subsequent 3 reigns, this was one of the most thriving and prosperous periods of Indochinese feudalism. Along the way, the capital city was moved to a better defensive position by taking maximum advantage of the topography and its natural as well as man-made features. This was how Hanoi became the new capital city location. The cost of relocation was easily absorbed given the large tax-paying population, not to mention the taxable profits made by the manufacturing bourgeoisie and capitalists with their skilled labor force in workshops and shipyards. Northern Vietnam had a ready-to-use transport system of rivers and canals and very fertile agricultural lands. As importantly, the new capital would house the agrarian noble bosses. They were now required to live there while attending court for prolonged annual periods. Everyone knew that this was so the secret police could keep him or her under close surveillance. The boss hierarchy in all of these servitude-epic societies is always necessary but inherently treasonous. By AD 1054, the royal government had introduced encouraging economic expansion measures, including tax reduction, budget balancing, and budgetary surplus. The regime enthusiastically encouraged local production by setting the pace in buying Indo-Chinese-made products. It did not stop there, but began stockpiling woven silk and other fabrics. This gave price stability to both big and small capitalists so that they would not be swamped by cheaper imports from Chinese merchants. Now the fourth king concentrated on improving the lives of ordinary people. Accordingly, he commanded the building of Ko Za Dike along the part of the Red River flowing through Hanoi to protect the capital city from unexpected floods. Killing of buffalo and oxen used in rice field plowing was prohibited. His administration introduced financing for ships and dockside maintenance to encourage domestic trade, and government expenditures on Indo-Chinese manufactured items supported the petty bourgeois artisans who made the dyes, fabrics, paper, copper, and furniture. And all of this was improvement in the lives of ordinary people was undertaken because ordinary people were becoming increasingly restless that their cut of the action was not good enough. To prevent that from developing into dangerous rebellion that would be fueled in such a way, all of these measures helped a great deal. Under Tan Long and his successors from AD 1225 to AD 1400, that is for the next nearly 2 centuries, the monarchy continued to be a principal economic and industrial engine. The long international and domestic peace enhanced Hanoi's reputation as a stable credit and commerce reliable city. Accordingly, the increasing foreign trade provided many new opportunities for both local residents and foreign merchants. These were mainly from China and Central Asia. They now made the investment necessary to open permanent missions for commodity exchange. And so you can see that all of the germinals of mercantile capitalism are expanding very rapidly. To the degree that armed force was used by the regime, it was done so to improve agriculture through increasing the area of cropland gained by war with non-tribute paying neighbors or from domestic eminent domain laws. Either way, for ordinary people, there was more irrigated agricultural land. The economic development policies adopted by these early kings were inherited. That is, these ideas had been formulated by a famous general in Vietnam's history named Tran Tu Do. It was he who had decided to bolster the economic development of the capital city in the ways now employed by successive kings. His idea had been to use the money saved to support the army. However, money can be used for any purpose, so initially the Tran dynasty was best known for its three triumphant defeats of the terrifying armed forces of the Mongols in AD 1258, AD 1285, and AD 1288. But remember that this was the time that the Mongol armies were blasting through many Asian and European borders. And later, of course, this money could be used in other ways. Monetization. Gold now was used as money, the basic coin being a tael, T-A-E-L, or tael. Each tael could be exchanged for 70 quan, Q-U-A-N, another coin minted and circulated by the royal government from AD 1225 to AD 1253. This currency was then used to pay personal tax, 1 quan per head each year. This was a radical new form of raising money, as it put legitimacy to the idea of mass taxable persons. This new variable was inherently adjustable. So the revenue from farming production was now quantifiable. Payment in kind levied on paddy rice fields, paid in rice, was less so, and inherently a major source of cheating then and now on the part of the tax collectors. Other commodity taxes on salt, fish, vegetable, and consumer goods were now quantifiable with previously unimagined accuracy. Indochina featured a series of border wars between Hanoi and its southern neighbor, the Kingdom of Champa. The Tran regimes demonstrated the superior military strength, a strength that came from bourgeois capital accumulation. Champa gradually gave way to Hanoi's southern expansion. Nome script was invented and used in the AD 1200s, and the first history work written in Vietnam was finished in AD 1272 by Li Van Thuo. The whole government, AD 1400 to 1407, succeeded the Tran regimes. It engineered more financial instruments, including a weight and volume measure system, and it further improved the river transport system and the system for collecting taxes and fees from merchants. It stepped up building foodstuff reserves to prevent market price fluctuation, and Ho continued improving budgetary discipline. However, conflict with latifundistas, as well as urban merchants and their urban artisans, led to Ho's removal. Taxes and fees by the feudalist central government in Vietnam's history were often used for unproductive, mostly war contracting, such as weaponry and military food reserves. Insufficient funds were used in dike building to prevent cropland flood that frequently occurred in the Red River Delta, and this meant famine and starvation of common farmers. The seeds of the regime's own destruction were being sown, especially since these taxes were a heavy financial burden that ordinary people were forced to accept. Tax relief became the slogan of mass resistance. Just a quick note, whenever you have taxes, you have tax evasion. You can't have one without the other. And wherever you have taxes, you're going to have a demand for tax relief from one or more sectors of the population. Now, another popular demand was for land grants, particularly for the most fertile cropland. King Li Tai To, 1428 to 1433, acceded to these demands and redistributed land to masses of common farmers, as well as to his officers and men, those who had served him well during the 10-year war with China's Ming troops had to be rewarded. Supplying food and clothing to any army is a necessary and expensive task. Li Tai To, when engaged in fighting against the Ming troops, had a regular payrolled army of 250,000 soldiers. After his victory, the Li still kept a 100,000-man army, and this was another growing financial burden on taxpayers. King Li Tan Tong, 1449 to 1497, was a talented feudalist leader of Vietnam First, he did not forget the Vietnamese farmers, giving them support in tax and infrastructure policy. His administrative measures encouraged farmers to improve both farming techniques and their own work-hour planning. They were given unused lands for cultivation rather than leaving them for speculation. Expanding those newly cultivated farmlands into the jungles of rural Vietnam had the inherent corollary of strengthening the economic power of his kingdom. As a royal candidate of the urban bourgeoisie, Lee's policies reflected their desire for a progressive view in developing a better and thriving commercial Hanoi. Thus, his administration made non-stop efforts to encourage trade activities, including significantly improving roads and river transportation. Lee established many new markets as well as new ports along major rivers and on important coastal areas, and there was a boom in trade and domestic manufacturing. This king decisively advanced economic growth by replanning the then largest urban area of Hanoi. His plan produced a city with 36 trading streets, each of which was specialized to specific categories of goods. Today, Hanoi is referred to as 36 Pho Phong, that is, the city of 36 trading streets. Artisans and skilled workers from outside made their commitment to Hanoi. This attracted even more foreign merchants seeking entrepreneurial opportunities in a promising land. This boom of entrepreneurship, commerce, manufacturing techniques, and transportation was exactly the same as occurred in Germany, the Benelux countries, northern France, and England not too much later. The bourgeoisie was emerging as the dominant class because they made money by making things of use value and exchange value, especially in Vietnam, where high-quality silk, embroidery and embroidery cloths, handmade jewelry, furniture, copper appliances, leather products, casting and printing services. The major weakness of the productive economy under Lee was an inadequate foreign market. However, that was not something he could solve by himself. His pursuit of trade and economic development needed support from the cash-holding latifundistas. This class of landed nobles would have preferred the Chinese imperial course and advocated burning the traders and their fleets out of existence. Even so, Lee was able to maintain a very busy foreign trade port at Van Don. This was one of the 5 major ports of Vietnam's early capitalist history. Overall, his economic policies boosted entrepreneurial efforts by urban residents and farmers, and the level of an average person's affluence was significantly improved over previous times. This was reflected in advances in science and technology. At the end of the AD 1500s, Vietnam's part of Indochina was moving into a long period of brutal civil wars. Then from AD 1627 to 1672, 2 major noble families fought for control of the kingdom. These families were led by the Lords Trinh and Nguyen. They both had many members of the family holding high ranks in the Lee regime. These 2 lords had accumulated a firm grip over the entire country. They had de facto divided Vietnam into the north and the south. Lord Trinh controlling the north, and Lord Nguyen the south. The current King Lee had been reduced to being a powerless monarch. This situation lasted 150 years, from AD 1627 to 1777. In the south, a new foreign trade started to emerge in the early AD 1600s. Portuguese traders were the first new foreign business people when they arrived in the town of Hoi An. It was a port near Da Nang. At the same time, the Dutch had occupied the Java Islands of today's Indonesia in AD 1594. The Dutch, being Protestant, were not constrained by the Catholic Pope Borgia's division of the world between the 2 papist powers of Spain and Portugal. In AD 1614, the first Portuguese proceeded to build a cannon molding mill as a lucrative business operation in Tuan Hoa town near Hue. As you know, this was an important city in Vietnam's central region. Then the French arrived at Hoi An, port city, in AD 1686. The French ship Michel embarked on Hoi An in AD 1749 and presented a letter from the French king proposing a formal diplomatic relationship with Lord Nguyen. He received this mission with warmest regards, it was reported. Now, in the north, the presence of Portuguese ships and sailors also occurred in the early AD 1600s. In AD 1637, a Portuguese commercial town in today's Hung Yen province called Pho Yen emerged with Dutch trading shops. Pho Yen became a commercial hub in the north, with exciting trading opportunities for Vietnamese as well as foreign merchants. Following the Portuguese and Dutch businessmen were many Japanese, Chinese, and Siamese, that is Thai, business people. Upon arrival, they set up commercial operations, making Pho Yen the second most important urban area in the north after Hanoi. Pho Yen, at the peak of its flourishing business season, had over 2,000 shops. This boom of trade in Vietnam led to the first Romanization of Vietnamese language. It was done by Alexander de Rhodes, who lived from 1591 to 1660, who was a French Roman Catholic missionary and scholar living in the East Indies. He produced a Vietnamese to Latin to Portuguese dictionary and published it in Rome in AD 1651. The financialization of international trade began with Japanese trade coins circulating as money. Alexander de Rhodes said in his history book that the then current coin in the north was a large copper coin brought in from Japan. These were supplemented in circulation by small coins minted locally. These large coins were circulated throughout Vietnam, but the small coins were used only in the capital and 4 surrounding districts. The value of the local coin varied depending on the quantities brought in each year, but was normally priced at 10 small cash to 6 large. Alexander de Rhodes, in his history of the Royaume de Touquin of Lyon in 1651, provides the details. In AD 1637, the British East India Company set up shop in Pho Yen, today called Pho Hien. Its register proves activity in the coin trade. In coin trade in Pho Yen, 1672 to 1676, shows that on August 22, 1672, 3 Dutch ships arrived from Batavia, bringing 6 million in Japanese cash and 1,000 tael of silver. On April 7, 1765, 1 Chinese junk arrived from Japan with copper, cash, and silver. And in the same year, June 17, 1675, 1 Dutch ship arrived from Batavia with 80 chests of Japanese cash. And then the next year, on February 23, 1676, 2 Chinese junks arrived from Japan to bring silver and cash. So other English traders came to do business in Vietnam in 1672. Their first ship, the Zant, arrived, and its captain asked for a license to open a shop in Pho Yen. His company ceased trading there due to insufficient profit and left town in 1697. In AD 1680, a French ship came to Pho Yen, followed by another French ship, the St. Joseph, in 1682. Trading activity in the north declined when Dutch businessmen stopped their operations in 1700. After AD 1700, foreign trade further weakened because of religious conflict between Lord Trinh and Lord Nguyen and Catholic missionaries. These Catholic missionaries and their acolytes were proselytizing in both the north and the south. From 1771 forward, Vietnam was embroiled in civil war. The Siamese in 1782 to 1785 and the Chinese Qing in 1789 got involved respectively. Nguyen Hue later became king of the Nguyen Tay Son regime in 1788 and defeated Siamese naval troops in 1785. In 1789 he defeated the Qing army, whose military help had been invited by Nguyen An and the last king of the Li regime, Lê Chui Tông. The Nguyen Tay Son regime lasted only 14 years. In 1802, Lord Nguyen An became king. Now, with regard to industry under Nguyen Tay Son, from one viewpoint, the regime did not perform well. This lackadaisical performance was due to the never-ending wars against Thailand and China that brought no positive economic results. And meanwhile, Nguyen An, who lived 1877 to 1820, The male heir of the powerful Lord Nguyen in the north, who had been orphaned by the Tay Son Nguyen brothers, plotted a comeback. However, in the end, retreat was the better part of his valor, and he quietly returned to the south coastal provinces. There, he encouraged farming and expansion of cropland through jungle reclamation. His soldiers were required to help in crop harvesting, giving a positive economic aspect to their otherwise dead-ass negative when in barracks or on front lines. His trade policy was also positive. Foreign merchants were encouraged to trade in his territory, thus earning the cash he needed to buy metal and explosives rather than levy taxes on farmers. Government purchases were honest, based on the going market price. Domestic merchants were allowed to barter trade with foreigners for weapons and military materials. In 1873, France provoked military conflict with the weak Vietnam government. French troops invaded all major regions of Vietnam. The French invaders had a final solution in mind, of course. This was just their most recent version of what European imperialists had been doing in Africa and Asia. Over the years, the French had gained a lot of practical experience. They began to impose what they called protectorates via unfair treaty agreements that subjugated the Vietnamese province by province until they had gobbled up the whole country. This was the starting point for the next 80 years of the French colonization. France would not leave until decisively defeated by the Vietnamese Communist Army at Dien Bien Phu in 1953. Meanwhile, the minting of coins had been codified with clear rules and monitored closely by the federal monarchy government. In monetary terms, 1 tael of gold was equivalent in exchange with 10 taels of silver. The monarchy's government established a new coin minting mill that ensured the adequacy of the money supply for foreign and domestic trade and general economic activity. In 1893, apart from silver and gold coins, the government also minted lower value copper and zinc coins. His government stipulated the weight measure systems to facilitate trade. Old roads were repaired and new roads were built. Dikes and irrigation systems were renovated and protected. Town rice reserve storage silos were built so that in an emergency, the regime could immediately supply food to impacted villages and regions. The French now moved to impose a Western-style administration on their colonial territories and to open them to economic exploitation. In 1897, Governor General Paul Doumer arrived, and he imposed French rule directly at all levels of administration, leaving the Vietnamese bureaucracy without any real power. Even Vietnamese emperors were deposed at will and replaced by others willing to serve the French. Important positions within the bureaucracy were staffed with officials imported from France, using the Vietnamese as low-level employees at very low salaries. French Indochina was designated as a colony of economic interest, quote-unquote, by the French government. The rapid and systematic exploitation of Indochina's potential wealth was for the benefit of France. Vietnam became a source of raw materials and a market for tariff-protected goods produced by French industries. The railroads, highways, harbors, bridges, canals, and other public works built by the French started Doumer funding for the colonial government came by means of taxes on Vietnamese. What was forcibly collected from the farmers formed 56% of the colonial budget. The French government raised the rest of their colonial operating budget in Vietnam by establishing a monopoly on the trade of opium, salt, and rice alcohol. Now this accounted for 44% of the colonial's government's budget by 1920. The colony's principal bank was the Bank of Indochina, Banque de Indochine, established in 1875. It was responsible for minting the colony's currency, the Indochinese piastre. By 1940, after Algeria, Indochina was the second most invested in French colony. French capitalists had invested 6.7 million francs to finance their export of rice, coal, rubber, and rare earth minerals from Vietnam. They were not interested in promoting industry in Vietnam, which would only produce products in competition with their own produced at home or in another colony. Vietnamese production of goods was only allowed for those things immediately consumed. Such enterprises, limited as they were, should be located in Saigon, Hanoi, and Haiphong, easily policed. Breweries, distilleries, small sugar refineries, rice and paper mills, and glass and cement factories were permitted. The largest establishment was a textile factory at Nam Dinh, which had been a cheap labor replacement for French proletarians who cost too much for these masters of the universe. The Nam Dinh French capitalists-owned textile factory employed 5,500 workers. Workers employed by all industries and mines in Vietnam totaled 100,000 in 1930. In 1930, the growing automobile industry in France resulted in the growth of the rubber industry in Indochina. Rubber plantations were built throughout the colony, especially at Annam and Cochin China. France, that is from the central and southern part of Vietnam. France soon became a leading producer of rubber through its Indochina colony, and Indochinese rubber became prized in the industrialized world. The success of rubber plantations in French Indochina led greedy capitalists to increase their investment in the colony. Coming out on top was Michelin. New factories produced textiles, cigarettes, beer, and cement for export throughout the French Empire. Only a small fraction of the profit was reinvested in Vietnam. Economic progress in Vietnam benefited only the French and their small comprador class. The masses of the Vietnamese people got nothing, and this was ensured by the social policies of Doomer and his liberal successors. Through the construction of irrigation works, chiefly in the Mekong Delta, the area of land devoted to rice cultivation quadrupled between 1880 and 1930. During the same period, however, the individual peasant's rice consumption decreased without the substitution of other foods. The new lands were not distributed among the landless and the peasants, but were sold to the highest bidder or given away at nominal prices to Vietnamese collaborators and French speculators. These policies created a new class of Vietnamese landlords and a class of landless tenants who worked the fields of the landlords for rents of up to 60% of the crop, 60%. Now, which was sold by the landlords at the Saigon export market. The mounting export figures for rice resulted not only from the increase in cultivatable land, but also from the growing exploitation of the peasantry. The peasants who owned their land were rarely better off than the landless tenants. The peasants' share of the price of rice sold at the Saigon export market was less than 25%. Peasants continually lost their land to the large owners because they were unable to repay loans given them by the landlords and other moneylenders at exorbitant interest rates. As a result, the large landowners of Cochin China, that is the southernmost part of Vietnam, less than 3% of the total number of landowners, owned 45% of the land, while the small peasants, who accounted for about 70% of the owners, owned only about 15% of the land. And the number of landless families in Vietnam before World War II was estimated at 50% of the population. The peasants' share of the crop after the landlords, the moneylenders, and the middlemen, mostly Chinese, between producer and exporter, had taken their share, was still more drastically reduced by the direct and indirect taxes the French had imposed to finance their ambitious program of public works. Other ways of making the Vietnamese pay for the projects undertaken for the benefit of the French were the recruitment of forced labor for public works and the absence of any protections against exploitation in the mines and rubber plantations, although the scandalous working conditions, the low salaries, and the lack of medical care were frequently attacked in the French Chamber of Deputies in Paris. The mild social legislation decreed in the late 1920s was never adequately enforced at any rate. Apologists for the colonial regime claim that the French rule led to vast improvements in medical care, education, transport, and communications. The statistics kept by the French, however, appear to cast doubt on such assertions. In 1939, for example, no more than 15% of all school-aged children received any kind of schooling, and about 80% of the population was illiterate. in contrast to pre-colonial times when the majority of the people possessed some degree of literacy. With its more than 20 million inhabitants in 1939, Vietnam had but one university with fewer than 700 students. Only a small number of Vietnamese children were admitted to the lycées, that is, the secondary schools, for the children of the French. Medical care was well organized for the French in the cities, but in 1939 there were only 2 physicians for every 100,000 Vietnamese, compared with 76 per 100,000 in Japan and 25 per 100,000 in the Philippines. 2 other aspects of French colonial policy are significant when considering the attitude of the Vietnamese people, especially their educated minority, toward the colonial regime. One was the absence of any kind of civil liberties for the native population, and the other was the exclusion of the Vietnamese from the modern sector of the economy, especially industry and trade. Not only were rubber plantations, mines, and industrial enterprises in foreign hands, French, where the business was substantial, and Chinese at the lower levels, but all other business was as well, from local trade to the great export-import houses. The social consequence of this policy was that, apart from the landlords, no property-owning indigenous middle class developed in colonial Vietnam. Thus, capitalism appeared to the Vietnamese to be part of foreign rule. This view, together with the lack of any Vietnamese participation in government, profoundly influenced the nature and orientation of the national resistance movements. And in the next lecture, we're going to discuss the formation of the Communist International, the Indochinese Communist Party, the role of Ho Chi Minh, and within the context of what you can see was extreme oppression of French imperialism, why it was so easy for them to create a great massive base in such a short period of time. So within that comment, well, I will conclude this particular lecture.